Thank you. Thank you, Robin, and a very good afternoon to all. Sorry that we're running slightly late. My name is Tatiana Gallego. I'm the Chief for Housing and Urban Development at the Inter-American Development Bank, and it's a real pleasure to almost be closing, the sessions of the Caribbean Urban Forum. I'm really delighted to be your moderator for this last session. And just to put it in context, I just wanted to mention that, as many of you know, sustainability is a core element of the IDB's work. Long-term economic growth and the reduction of poverty and inequality in Latin America and the Caribbean depend on development that is economically, financially, environmentally, socially, and institutionally sustainable. The geographic location of the region, and especially the Caribbean, makes it susceptible to natural disasters like hurricanes, landslides, droughts, earthquakes. And some of these events will become more frequent and intense due to climate change. In addition, disasters seem to disproportionately affect the poor in Latin America and the Caribbean, which, let's not forget, remains one of the, if not the most unequal region in the world. Therefore, for us, building resilience is critical to fighting inequality and avoiding setbacks in development. Many countries in the region, especially in the Caribbean, have taken incredible strides to reform priority sectors. And traditionally, this was in areas like health, education, pensions, fiscal management. But nowadays, and most importantly, we're seeing that the states of the Caribbean not only, have recognized the threat of climate change, never entering in denial, but on top, they're taking the leadership on ensuring that, they are implementing transformation towards sustainability. Governments, we've seen, and we're going to talk about that later on, are enacting laws and policies aimed at protecting the environment. And, we have cases like, for instance, the ban of single-use plastics in Belize or the Bahamas or Jamaica, but also the amazing work that, Barbados has done in terms of coastal protection. IDB is working through its entire array of instruments, both reimbursable and non-reimbursable, to support this path to sustainability. For those that are not aware, IDB offers 4 lending categories, and maybe, the one that we're best known for is investment loans, which finance, basically, goods, public works, or services. But IDB also has, other instruments like policy-based loans or PBLs, which provide our borrowing member countries with flexible, liquid funding to support reforms or institutional changes in a particular sector or subsector. To be eligible for, a policy-based loan or a PBL, sorry, I'll use so much, I'm so used to the acronym that I'll use it maybe more and more frequently. To being eligible, the country needs to have a sound macroeconomic policy framework, and that's just the basis to make sure that, it's used adequately. And the size may vary depending on the country's financing needs. In addition to that, for those that don't know, PBLs, disbursements are done against the completion of reform measures, and not, as I was mentioning earlier on, against specific expenses. We have 2 different types of PBLs, just to provide you the framework, because you'll hear about different elements this afternoon. One of them, which maybe is the oldest or most traditional, is the multi-tranche policy-based loan, which consists of 2 or more tranches within a single operation, and where the disbursement conditions for each tranche are specified at the beginning of the operation. In addition to that, that's for cases where a thing is extremely clear. But as we know, very often, we are confronted with, some adjustments that, we need to take into account. And for that, IDB developed another different, PBL type called programmatic policy-based loans, which consist again of a series of single tranche operations within a well-specified, medium-term framework, framework of policy or institutional actions, which allow us, for more flexibility. This approach involves, some clear monitorable indicators and progress milestones. It includes, triggers for moving from one operation in the series to the next, and also a notional timing and amount, that will be required for the subsequent operations. This approach captures, well, the concept of medium to long-term nature, which, very often, are associated with policy and institutional reforms, given that despite the urgency, one needs to build, buy-in and consensus, be collaborative, consultative, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, it's an instrument that gives, some flexibility to adjust to new information and changing circumstances. Now, from land management to circular economy, the use of PBLs has been transformational in supporting, countries in the region advance their own vision towards a sustainable and resilient future, and at the same time receive support and know-how from our specialists in the bank, which are here to serve you. To talk about, different examples and different experiences of how this has been done, we have three specialists with us today. And they're going to present you their experiences with a programmatic policy-based loan in Barbados, the Bahamas, and Mexico. The first of the three that will be, appearing in camera in a second is Robin Brajak. Robin is on site today, if you want, accompanying you. And he has worked as a lead specialist for housing and urban development at the Inter-American Development Bank since 2014. He's engaged in operations, in research, in policy dialogue, and emerging programs on metropolitan governance, but also, a very, heavy and committed work to supporting the Caribbean. Before joining IDB, Robin, worked at the World Bank for more than a decade on land, housing, and urban development, primarily in South Asia. So he brings, a whole array of knowledge from elsewhere and Latin America. And previously, he served as the founding director of the Land Settlement Agency in Trinidad and Tobago, and holds an MPhil and a PhD both in land economics from the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. Our second speaker today, I'll do them all in one go, is Gerard Allen. Gerard joined IDB in 2008, so 2008, as a clean energy and climate change specialist, and currently works in the climate change division of the bank as a senior climate change senior specialist. Gerard coordinates the division's adaptation and mitigation activities in the Caribbean region. So he has a deep knowledge of the Caribbean itself. And prior to joining IDB, he was a policy fellow with the Center for Energy and Environmental Policy at University of Delaware. When he was in that position, he managed projects that focus on renewable energy and climate change issues. Gerard holds a master's degree in energy and environmental policy from the University of Delaware, and also a master's degree in wetlands ecology from the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. And, Gerard is a Caribbean Fulbright scholar. And last, for today, and slightly from outside the Caribbean, a different experience, but, we thought it was very interesting and complementary on territorial planning. We have Ophélie Chevalier working with us. She's a lead specialist in urban development and housing. Again, the same division as Robin and myself. And she has more than 20 years of experience in international development, which includes project management, the design of sectoral strategies and policy dialogue with authorities, and also leadership in technical studies. The IDB of Ali has specialized in particular in institutional strengthening, in local development, in housing subsidies, and in neighborhood improvement programs. Her current work also includes serving as the divisional focal point for supramunicipal coordination, and before that she worked in climate change, as a focal point for climate change and risk issues. Ophélie is a lawyer by training, and she has also a master's from the University of Paris and Columbia University in New York. With that, and with this, slightly extensive introduction to our topic of today, I thank you all for being with us, and I hand over to Robin for our first presentation of today on the case of Barbados. Robin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tatiana, and thank you to the faithful few who have remained to the end. When we conceptualized the session in discussion with Asad and Perry and others and Yolanda, it was to look at how the development banks can engage with governments or to make more aware to other countries who are in the region, other ways in which you can engage with development banks on the sustainability agenda beyond the traditional brick and mortar investments that we're familiar with. And many of you, especially those with more of a research orientation, have always made the case for policy, that policy matters, that investments outside of coherent policy often don't achieve their intended objective. And you also know that policy, and I'm using the word more broadly and generically, is a long-term agenda. And it's not simply the passage of a piece of legislation or ordinance, but requires intentional follow-up to ensure that what is hoped for is actually materializing. And if it isn't, making the amendments, as we see time and time again with legislation, amendments, because our understanding is improving of how things function or don't function. So these loans, as was referred to, if I could ask the presentation to be loaded. These loans, as Tatiana mentioned, are not about the brick and mortar. We know that governments will always have to allocate money for capital investment related to sustainability, related to the environment, and increasingly related to the threats associated with climate change. But we understand that these investments, especially in an island context, are critical, need to be understood in the context of the intersection of land use, of water resource management, of our coastal zone management. And in small islands, there's not much distinction between the national territory and the coastal zone, and increasingly hazard management, as we are pounded year in, year out by hurricanes. So this graphic just sort of summarizes, tries to make the point that land use management is pretty much at the heart of an intersection of much of these topics. The government of Barbados also recognized this, and in their conceptualization of their overarching program to deal with and to position their investments and their mobilization of finance for sustainability under the rubric of roofs to reefs. And this graphic simply is illustrating the variety of sectors that are part of that agenda, and the fact that the government in its policy articulation is emphasizing that what we do in any part of the territory affects the other. If we depend, as we do in this country, upon the coastal zone for economic activity, particularly our tourism product, we can't be, we cannot afford not to be mindful of what is coming down the hillsides and what is percolating into the nearshore environment, whether it's from our rooftops and inadequate stormwater management, whether it's sewage, and only a very small proportion of the island has formal sewage, or whether it's agricultural product, whether fertilizer or pesticides. They all make their way into the nearshore environment, and in that way compromise the quality of the water and ultimately lead to acidification affects the coral. That's just one angle of the interrelationship, of course. The other aspect of sustainability that may be more familiar to the majority of people participating in this conference is the way in which land is used for built development. And as part of our metrics around the Emerging and Sustainable Cities Initiative, for which we did 6 case studies in the Caribbean, we mapped over time, over a number of decades, the evolution of the built-up footprint in each of those cases, and many cases, about 70 altogether in the region. But in the case of Barbados, you see the amount of development that has occurred in more recent decades, not so much the last decade, in the southeast and on the upper western parts of the coast. Particularly in the West Coast, a lot of that new development has infringed upon what is considered to be the highest or most sensitive groundwater zones. This is a country that gets most of its potable water supply from the ground. So that, of course, is a very significant issue. So that, too, is very much part of the thinking behind the sustainability agenda and what would a comprehensive package of policy reforms look like to address it. I'm going to speed through a couple of these graphics. These, again, just playing at the interrelationship that exists on this topic. You know, if you just looked at the left-hand side of the diagram, we all learned that at school, right? But when you think about, and you could say, okay, everything works in a harmonious way, and that's how we thought about it. That's how I thought about it as a kid. But when you bring in the right side of it, and built development, and agricultural activity that is essential to our livelihoods and to our lives, we see that there's a lot mixing with that blue or clean environment that produces that is a process that really needs to be managed well. I'm not going to go into this, but this is another graphic from the what is referred to as the AMSEC report here that again plays at these points to these relationships. So the government and the bank agreed upon a general objective in trying to, in this aspect of addressing the topic. There are other aspects. We have 3 operations in the energy sector, all of which have a sustainability focus. So I'm not saying that this is the be all and end all, but when we decided to engage on the policy agenda, the objective was to improve the country's governance for sustainability, broadly defined, through the strengthening and modernization of the regulatory framework. And with that are 3 specific objectives. 1, to improve the efficiency and sustainability of spatial planning, development control, and water resource management. The second, to improve natural asset management, especially in the coastal zone. And thirdly, to improve disaster risk management and resilience. So that was those were the brackets that we agreed upon to categorize the sets of reforms, bearing in mind that in parallel, we have both investment and regulatory reforms going on in the energy sector, which is a big part of the government's sustainability focus. And to meet these objectives, the government and the bank agreed upon this programmatic policy-based loan series, a 3-part series consisting of 3 technically related and financially and contractually independent operations. That's a language we use to distinguish it from multiple tranches of one operation. So we envision a series, and we envision policy and regulatory processes as obviously not one-stop exercises, things that take years, sometimes decades to accomplish. So we envision it, but we envision, the government envisions, and the bank works on that process of where does this go in 2 to 3 years down the road, and what are the kinds of outcomes we're expecting from this logic in terms of reform. but each operation in this PBP is independent. So you're not guaranteed the second or the third. It really depends upon the progression. And I'll elaborate. So the three loans that I'm referring to here, the first was in March 2020 for $80 million US. The second was in December 2021 for $100 million. And the third, we await the advice of the government as to when that would be required. So the point here, just to make it absolutely clear, unlike investment loans, these are single disbursements of liquidity, but they're given, the disbursement is contingent upon, as I'll elaborate on this in the next slide, the disbursements are contingent upon progression in a pre-agreed reform agenda. The general logic across the series from PBP, the first operation, second and third operation, was that building upon what the government had already begun prior to engaging the bank on this topic, the first set of operations mostly looked at consultative processes and launch of reforms, green papers and things of that like, key sectoral studies, that kind of thing. The second operation, consolidating that into policies, plans, regulations, and expansion of technological applications that had pre-existed, and deepening of some of these assessments. And then the third operation, which is not yet begun, but for which the groundwork is already being built, would be parliamentary tabling of new laws or amendments, establishment of protocols and guidelines, and launching of supporting plans. This is not exactly how it works. In some parts of the first agenda, the first loan, we did have legislation. The proclamation of the Planning and Development Act, for example. But generally, we're looking at a deepening, that sort of logic of conceptualization to all the way to legislation. So the first component, and which I won't spend any real time on, but it's important to stress in any policy-based loan, is macroeconomic stability. It does not make sense, it is not diligent for a bank and government to engage upon substantial amounts of increased liquidity coming from the development bank for any agenda, no matter how important or pressing, if the macroeconomics of the country are questionable, if the part is not sustainable. And so the first thing we have to do is conduct what is called a macroeconomic, all right, my brain is tired on a Friday afternoon, an independent assessment of macroeconomic conditions, IAMC. So that is done by our country economists and conjunction with the IMF and other development partners to make sure that both bank and government are confident of the macroeconomic situation. You don't bring additional liquidity, or you shouldn't bring additional liquidity into a situation where the macroeconomic fundamentals are not being currently managed. So that's the premise. If that was not in order, we should not have the next slides that follow. But we do have the next slides because that assessment was favorable. And of course, we were doing this in the context of a country that was going through an IMF program. So there was a lot of due diligence and benchmarks being assessed and being monitored regarding macroeconomic stability. So we can now focus upon these other agendas, which the IMF themselves identified as critical to the strength of the economy, given the dependence of this economy upon its natural environment. So spatial planning, development control, water resource management is that first grouping. And I'm just going to highlight the key reforms. The first category, the first column is basically PBP 1, the second loan, the third, what prospectively will be in the third operation. But you will see that the proclamation of the Planning and Development Act, I see Dr. Mohammed is here. I know the long, long journey you've had in Trinidad and Tobago. Sometimes an operation like this gives that extra oomph in terms of pushing for what has been a process in the works for some time to move to the next threshold, to move past the first threshold. So that was the case here, where not as long a process of legislative reform got that extra boost by being tied to this liquidity. So that legislation was actually proclaimed not until late last year. Going across, in terms of the second operation, the regulations for that act, the first set of regulations, General Development Order and the Environmental Impact Assessment regulations, had to be formalized and gazetted, become public, and therefore operationalize the act. That was done as part of the second operation. If we drop down a little bit, mandating that a version of the update to the physical development, the national plan, be approved for public consultation and be released for that purpose was one of those conditions in this series. And a technical brief highlighting the key changes between the last version of the physical development plan and the current. Looking forward, we want to see, obviously, in the next operation, the physical development plan fully revised and approved, and associated with that, an urban mobility plan. Getting into water resource management, the green paper on water protection and zoning, which established new zones, and importantly, more narrowly defined the zones where new development could not occur, was important. There are 166 square miles. So the more precise you are in determining where absolutely development should be restricted, the better. Because if you define it too bluntly, you're keeping land out of other productive uses that ought to be or that could safely be put. So it's not just about becoming more risk averse, it's becoming more informed about what kinds of development are allowed. And then you go across to the water order bill that was part of this last operation. And then we are looking at amendments to the Water Authority Act, Water Order Act, etc. Similarly, on stormwater management, and then following guidelines for rainwater harvesting in the sun. I'm just going to go through these quite quickly because I know we have limited time. The third component, natural capital management. The emphasis was on the ICZA Integrated Coastal Zone Management Policy in the first operation that had been approved by Cabinet. The ICZM plan was part of the second, again, Cabinet approval for that. Probable loss assessment done on beaches was presented yesterday. A strategic plan for the blue economy that Gerard Alling was fundamental in leading that work with the government. Very simple starting point, the Returnable Containers Act amendment that basically limited the amount of plastic in the natural environment was part of the first operation, and then guidelines for solid waste management. Ultimately, again, as you can see on the right, we're looking at legislation for the third. Importantly, however, when we put legislation in a policy matrix for these kinds of operations, what we're typically putting is the tabling of that legislation in the parliament. We don't typically put the outcome of in terms of a timeline for passage. We can't predict that very well. So it's really the tabling in the parliament of the legislation that is typically our reference. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult to manage the timelines with the other processes. And the final component is disaster risk management and resilience. Of course, we were hit by the first hurricane category 1, albeit last year, over 2,000 homes were affected. Raymond knows much more about that than I do. But it just shows us how much vulnerability we have, even at category 1. Under this policy-based loan series, the program, we had the comprehensive disaster management framework, the work program rather, developed as the condition for the first operation. We have, under the second operation, Barbados formally engaging in a contingent credit line. This is insurance for disaster triggers. So that was a separate operation in its own right, a loan operation, but in this case, a contingent credit line. That was a requirement for that to be in place. That itself is a long process, but was fulfilled as a condition for the second loan. And then the NCRIP system, the coastal planning information, the system you heard about yesterday from Ramon, that basically utilizes technology to properly generate risk assessment and hazard maps, and to screen all applications for development, especially in the coastal zone, in a systematic way. Again, allowing for a less blunt approach to regulating development. They can tell you what is the underlying substructure of a cliff to tell you whether or not you can build there, as opposed to say we just need a buffer because it's a cliff. That's the kind of precision we need when we have limited land space, and that's the direction which the government is moving. The reefs concept note, part of the first operation, the NDC update formally being launched with the UN was part of the second, and you can see where we intend to go in the third operation. And that's it. Alongside all of that was a bunch of technical cooperation support exercises between the IDB and the government. Other agencies in other development agencies would also been providing technical cooperation. The idea is that we don't just ask the government to fulfill these conditions. Wherever they desire to have some partnership with us, and we have relevant expertise, we provide technical cooperation funding to work alongside those reforms to accomplish them in a timeline that we hope. And that was our experience here. The last slide is simply about how do we know this is going to work, or how do we know if it worked? And there's a whole results matrix that goes with these operations. The measurement obviously cannot be 1 year after you disperse money. So it's really 2 years after the final operation. So that might be 5 or 6 years down the road from the first operation. And these are some samples of the kinds of indicators that have been used. Nitrate concentrations in groundwater would be an example. Probable losses to reduction in probable losses to built environment infrastructure in urban areas. These are some examples, just to tell you that when we do this, we also have to have a results matrix that looks at impacts down the road to see if these reforms are following the vertical logic that we had hoped they would accomplish. With that, I'm going to stop because I know I've gone quite long.
Thank you very much, Robin. Very interesting. In order to make sure we have enough time, I'm going to go straight on to Gerard, and I'm going to open the floor for questions at the end of the 3 interventions. So go ahead, Gerard.
Thank you, Tatiana, and good day to everyone. Let me just quickly share my screen. I think okay. Yep, hopefully that works.
Gerard, your volume is a little low. I don't know if it's possible to raise it.
I will try. Can you hear me? Yes,
yep, that's good.
Okay, great. I will just have to talk a little louder. No, thanks everyone, and good day again. I think Robin and Tatiana gave a very good overview of the PBL of the framework. So whatever you heard related to what we were doing in Barbados, basically it's the same sort of approach in terms of the framework, the skeleton of it, of the instrument that we have applied in the Bahamas. And this is the use of the PBL in terms of policy is not new. We have, and especially not even new in terms of sustainability, but we have been using it in a number of years and in various areas such as even climate change and sustainable energy. And this whole idea about sustainability, and Robin mentioned is though from his perspective, the way in which land is used. I'm coming from the other direction. For me, it is, and for a lot of what we are seeing, it is the sustainable utilization of our ocean resources in a way that is inclusive, that is that takes into consideration climate change, that takes into consideration circular economy or circularity. And that's from the perspective of how we engage with governments on this issue of a policy agenda. It is what is their interest? What is their policy agenda? And in this case with the Bahamas, there's been a strong agenda on the blue economy. And the programming that we have done within the last couple of years, this has been the focus of being competitive within the blue economy, being resilient within the blue economy, and even going even a little further. So just to give you an overview of that, just in terms of background, and we know for all of us within the Caribbean, we know this applies to many economies or many of the countries within the region, structural constraints to growth. In many cases, a weak business environment and vulnerability to natural disasters, as we see in the Bahamas. And Robin mentioned the issue with the situation with Barbados. I'm sure you remember the situation with Dorian in the Bahamas and the significant losses that they occurred. And then on top of that, we had COVID, and everybody has had their economies contracted as a result. But in spite of all of that, we also see the trend of a greater interest in this sustainable utilization of marine resources. And the blue economy provides for states with significant ocean resources, and you think of both the Bahamas, Barbados, but certainly the Bahamas, which is massive exclusive economic zone. It provides a high potential both for economic recovery, but also for economic diversification. And following that interest, following that agenda that the Bahamas has, and of course Barbados and other countries, that's the opportunity whereby there can be a strong focus and flow in terms of policy and to make these things happen. And that's where we sort of started the engagement, the conversation with the government of the Bahamas. Again, thinking in terms of what Robin had laid out in terms of how this worked, in terms of the macroeconomic stability, etc. Similarly, in the case of the Bahamas, we had a PBL, a programmatic PBL, which the focus was on promoting, as I indicated, competitiveness, particularly in terms of micro, small, and medium enterprises, and environmental resiliency. And under that big focus, we divided it into two areas, that of the objectives related to improving the business climate for SMEs and reducing the cost of doing business, and with the reforms that that the government wanted to support those reforms. And some of those reforms, this is just a really small snapshot. Things such as the business continuity program in operation, the process for obtaining a business license streamlined, enhancements of digital platforms for business registration, etc. On the resiliency side, there was sort of three areas that we said, okay, based on what the government is doing, and we see a digital logic in terms of resiliency. Three areas: protecting natural resources, protecting the environment, and promoting the blue economy. And looking at the activity, looking at the reforms, the agenda that was taking place, we basically looked at what we could be used as these triggers, as Robin had mentioned, as part of the policy-based loan. So again, a snapshot. If you know Bahamas, there's a strong emphasis on MPAs, and they have set new targets on the establishment of new MPAs. So we took that, even in terms of improving the management of the MPAs. And then there was, within the last, again, this would have started from 2019 and to present day, things such as strengthening the institutional framework on protection of the environment. So there has been, as part of the agenda, was the approval of new environmental impact assessment regulations, the enactment of an Environmental Protection Act, mainly as Tatiana had mentioned about control of plastic pollution. We saw it in Belize, and we have seen it in the Bahamas, and other actions there. And then of interest, and because this growing trend with regard to the blue economy, there we are seeing what we utilize were a number of initiatives that they were focusing on. One strong one, especially that we were really pleased with, was the new Fisheries Act, and looking at regulating, looking at greater protection for their fisheries resources, together with looking at a action plan for economic diversification with focus on the blue economy. So that was the bulk of the PBL. and the engagement with the government. Again, I want to stress, this was their agenda. And this was the agenda that we supported. And this is how we work with countries, as we have seen with in the case of Barbados too. As Robin mentioned, the support that we give and that we bring as we engage with governments, there's a number of technical corporations, a number of things that we bring to the table to help governments in defining this agenda, in helping to move the agenda along, in helping to finalize acts and policies and drafts, etc. And so what we were able to pull upon, or in terms of the Bahamas, was a series of technical support, both on, again, on the resiliency side, on the business competitive side, which was an interesting mix. But again, if you think of an island state or a state with significant coastal resources, they do fuse, because there's a lot of businesses that utilize the coastal resources or marine resources. And so the technical support, the value added, comes from all these programs that we have had, and also initiated during the time of the PBL development. One key thing, as I said, was the support to help advance that development, and also just the flow of the policy agenda, which I think also Robin mentioned. It's a continuum. It's moving along this policy continuum of actions to get to the outcome in terms of resiliency, in this case, in terms of improved competitiveness. One interesting thing that has come out of this, and it's a sort of new development within the continuum, is that as part of this policy discourse, we were able, and this happened last year, and there's an update on this, that we were able to see, can we use, even within this policy forum, a new instrument, an instrument that has not been used in terms of the sustainability agenda, but we have used it in the past and for other things. What we have is, as Tatiana said, we have different instruments, and we do have guarantees, and there's a policy-based guarantee. Can we apply it in the case of the Bahamas to help support, again, the advancement of this policy agenda? And we saw that, again, there was a strong push in terms of the blue economy, that to utilize the guarantee to promote policy reforms in this thematic area of the blue economy. So basically, it's to are the conditions that are typical of a policy-based operation, and the commitment to those conditions. If you commit to those, it will be used as the support for the guarantee. And so for the Bahamas, this is where we have gone in terms of the advancement in elements related to the blue economy, and this guarantee towards the standard issuance of a bond. And interestingly, as part of this, again, the whole policy discourse, it also opens the door for the preparation of a future blue bond by the government. So again, it's an interesting, new, innovative element to the use of a policy-based instrument, in this case, a guarantee, within the context of sustainability. So as I was saying, new policy ground here, and the guarantee was to promote a more productive and healthier ocean. Again, strong focus on blue economy. As we recall, we had the PBLs that, programming, the first two, the business case, the protecting natural environment, under the guarantee, we went further and more focused in terms of the blue economy. So it was improving business climate for those MSMEs that were working in the blue economy, reducing the cost of doing business within that area. And then, again, stronger elements, improving climate risk, and especially because of that what we're saying, the strong connection between climate change and blue economy, of how the blue economy is helping to address the impacts of climate change, to utilize policy work that's taking place there. Also in terms of promoting optimal use of marine resources and reducing marine pollution, all connected. How does this look in terms of the policy reforms? And there are basically like 4 big areas. Under the promotion of a more productive ocean, we had digitalization of blue economy services, improved fishing regulations. There are port digitalization program operation, digital payments for I think fishery services. Under improved resiliency of the blue economy, there was a promotion of policies related to use of nature-based solutions, the inclusion of coastal climate hazards in building code, a diagnostic of disaster risk management governance. Under the promotion of the healthier ocean, you had the promotion of better management of marine resources, such as things as a vessel monitoring system developed, implementation of maritime security plan, additional MPAs being approved, and then also things such as certification of lobsters under the Marine Stewardship Certification Program. And then the final one, in terms of reducing marine pollution, policies related to marine cleanup after an impact such as Hurricane Dorian, and then regulations related to the reduction of waste in the oceans. That's where the policy-based guarantee is sort of the policy space that it's operating in. And the government has committed to this, and the update has been that they have issued their bond, and it's been oversubscribed as of June 13th. So they have been successful in issuing this bond based on the guarantee that the bank has provided as a signal to say this is being supported by a financial institution such as the IDB. Where do we go from here? In terms of policy, I think we'll get into that shortly, but I see it as a there are new opportunities arising from how we are thinking about the use of financial innovations in terms of moving the policy agenda along. And especially for me, working within the blue economy, this is it's an interesting time. Thank you very much. Back over to you, Tatiana. I think you're on mute, Tatiana.
Thank you. No, I was saying thank you for another very interesting presentation on the use of the policy-based loan in the Caribbean, and in this specific case in the Bahamas. The last case that we have for you today is from Mexico. Ophelie is with us. What I'm going to do is I'm going to project the screen, and Ophelie, you tell me when you wish, when you want me to pass the slides.
Thank you so much, Stephanie.
I hope you can all see it.
Yes, we can.
Great. Okay.
Great.
The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here today. Hello, everyone. Turning my camera off. I don't have a great connection. I'll be talking a little bit in line, and I'm sorry if I'm repetitive because there's some concept my colleagues talked about that I will be mentioning again. But I'll try to focus my remarks on policy finance and how it has implication for urban resiliency. And I'll take the example of Mexico. Next slide, Tatiana. So as Tatiana and Robin mentioned, policy-based loans or policy financing are widely used in times of crisis as they allow for a quick response to a fiscal emergency. That's how we know them. That's why they've been created originally. But by conditioning budget support on the implementation of prior action, we can do more because we can nudge countries towards policy reforms. And that's why little by little, those programs became of great interest from the sectoral perspective. So I've put this picture there because the big question is, what are the implications of such instruments on transversal issues such as social and gender impact, and more than ever today, and especially in the Caribbean, climate resiliency. Next slide. I will be discussing such impact using the case study of a programmatic policy-based intervention in Mexico between 2018 and 2019. Basically, we designed and approved and disbursed 2 operations, each one for a total of $600 million. And the first question to ask ourselves is whether this policy financing makes sense to carry reforms in urban planning. That would be my first item. Then I suggest we look together at how policy financing can have a high development impact. Does it make sense to do policy financing instead of investment? And finally, and especially in the context of today's forum, does policy financing support territorial planning, can help fight climate change and foster climate resilience? Next slide. So to address requests to support reforms in territorial planning, I would like to walk you through the reasons why we think this is territorial planning is a key item on our agenda at the IDB. Robin already mentioned a lot on the topic, but basically urban and territorial planning are defined as a decision-making process aimed at realizing a series of goals through the development of a spatial vision, strategies and plans, and the application of a set of policies. They are powerful to reshape the forms and functions of cities and regions. And in that sense, they are helpful to reach more compact and efficient urban center, which is something we promote. But if we're talking about policy financing, we have to think about the ultimate goal of those reforms, because basically we want to do all this to reach more economic growth while addressing the needs of the most vulnerable groups. And this is where we have the justification for policy-based intervention instead, for example, of simple technical cooperation, technical assistance. Technical cooperation will provide technical assistance for consulting services, but it will not bring to the table a vision. It's not an instrument to make profound change. And we think that policy-based loan can do that. That said, policy financing applied to territorial reforms requires a very much tailor-made approach. And this is what I've learned in Mexico. In the case of Mexico, we had to consider the fact that this is a federal country with very long processes to make sure reforms happen at the local level. Our initial idea was to have the first operation to benefit the federal level and then have the second operation to target the subnational level. But we didn't think that between 2018 and 2019, we wouldn't be able to reach the subnational level with everything done at the federal level. We realized while preparing the first operation that the range of the reforms was so wide that the country could not, in one single operation, have a new set of regulation at the federal level. So we decided instead to focus on a few items. For instance, we worked on the national strategy for the country, metropolitan guides to encourage more institutionalization of metropolitan areas, and we include a few interventions at the state and municipal level with the idea that the country will have a sample of what needs to be done. In that effort, I want to insist that the bank is always a facilitator to support the vision of the technical counterpart in the country. Next slide. So the methodology we use to design this policy financing is the basic theory of change that everyone here knows. What we want to identify together, and again, I insist the country requesting and the technical team at the IDB work as a team, we want to identify the problem to solve. In the case of Mexico, the problem was decades of rapid urbanization that led to the expansion of urban footprint and sprawling, bringing city growth to high levels of fragmentation. This phenomenon affected the cost to deliver public services. It impoverished the most vulnerable families who were spending a large portion of their income in transportation. And it also affected levels of productivity and environment quality. So when we start working on this, Mexico had already approved a new law on territorial reforms, but there was a lot to do to make it a reality. And what we did is basically we worked together through each sub-problem, and we tried to figure out how to bring solution to it. We wanted to make sure that for each solution, we would have an indicator to show change. So basically, the loan is organized in 3 lines. We have first regulations, second coordination, and third information systems. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, policy financing has received a lot of critique when we use it for a sector. Policy financing for fiscal reasons is easy to understand. Basically, we want cash. But when we work at the sector level, the idea is to see concrete changes, such as more houses, if it's a housing project, a beautiful historic center, if it's urban regeneration, or more connected neighborhoods, if it's a neighborhood upgrading program. Those things, we know how to do it. But how about territorial reform? What would be the development impact of such program? In the case of Mexico, where the objective was to lay the foundations for the strengthening of a new territorial and urban development model, we agreed with our counterparts on 3 indicators. The first one looks at the time people take to go from their home to their work. It was an important indicator considering the reality of Mexico. We thought it would tell a lot about cities becoming more compact. Now, a few years later, 2022, first loan was approved in 2018, and we just finished the evaluation of the policy financing in Mexico. And what did we see? Well, we simply realized that this indicator was too ambitious. We cannot, in 4 years, show such change. So to me, this is a very important lesson learned. Indicators should never be too ambitious. The second indicator looked at the quantity of urban housing in city centers. This made sense to us since territorial planning creates the foundation to launch a housing policy. For these indicators, we do have positive numbers for a few municipalities that have been working on their planning. However, and again, if I had to do it again, I would have been much more precise and indicate the names of the municipalities we would be following through the years. Without that, it's difficult to pinpoint and give accurate follow-up to the indicators. The third indicator was a more reasonable one, I think. And we had identified beforehand the municipalities our counterpart would be working with. So we did well on this one. So to summarize, can policy finance make development impact? My answer is still yes, but the impact cannot be measured in the same time frame as the disbursement of a policy loan. Policy loans disburse fast based on the approval of a regulation. There is much more needed after such approval to create change, especially when you talk about territorial reforms. We learn our lessons, and in the second loan for Mexico, we included more indicators related to training and guides because those elements are important as well. Next slide. The last element I would like to discuss with you is how to make sure policy financing connect with climate resiliency, especially when working on territorial planning. A lot is done in each country about climate change. Training by NGOs, guides and exchange, and best practice by donors. There is a myriad of material. My lesson learned there is that it is worth taking the time to connect the dots and make sure all those efforts are brought to the table to nurture the vision of the reform. Indicators will have to be included in a policy matrix when we prepare a policy financing program. And in the case of Mexico, apart from making sure that the regulation would include transversal dimensions, we decided to create incentives to train officials in ministries. Again, I'm making the same point as I did before. Policy financing is more than just a check the box, I approve the law or regulation. It needs to be prepared and implemented with a team spirit where all the actors responsible to impact the reform feel partners of the vision and change to come. This is why I think, and I will finish on this note, policy financing makes sense at the sector level. It helps bring actors together behind a vision, which helps pool more resources in the medium and long term. Thank you very much, and I'm at your disposal to answer any question. Thank you, Tatiana, for taking care of the presentation.
Thank you, Ophélie. Let me just stop sharing. There we are. Fantastic. Well, thanks to our three speakers. Robin, I'm wondering if you could help me from your end to see if there is any questions already from the audience. Otherwise, I have some questions here that I would love to share with all of you. But I just wanted to know whether we have something from the audience first.
Any questions? At this point, no, Tatiana.
Okay, fantastic. Then, Robin, if you don't mind, I want to thank the three of you for fantastic presentations. And, I have three burning questions, one for each of you. I was wondering if, Robin, you could tell us, how did the IDB engage or how did the IDB engage the government of Barbados across such a diverse set of sectors? Because you've covered, a comprehensive set of areas, in terms of sustainability, in your PBP. So, I was wondering how did you manage that?
I think the key is that it was the government's conceptualization of the issues, and perhaps this is the convergence of these supposed sectors is more apparent when the territory is small, when the entire country is practically a coastal zone, and where the trade-offs, even on topics of land availability for solar farms, it's a trade-off with agriculture. So even two positive topics require important trade-off discussions. So it was really the government's conceptualization of roofs to reefs, basically top to bottom approach to sustainability. Otherwise, efforts in one area are likely to undermine the efficacy of those in the other. So that overarching framework was critical. And because of that, and because that vision came from the top, meaning at the level of the Prime Minister, at the level of the political manifesto, and that there were various working committees of the government and a ministry with responsibility for economic affairs and investment that championed that topic, with a focal point being identified in government for this overarching agenda. That created a mechanism for coordinating within government. But within the bank, we definitely needed many actors. We needed, and that's why this operation in the lexicon of development banks was triple booked. 3 different sectors of the bank co-leading the operation, Gerard being one, Yuri Chakalal from our resource management group being the third, to liaise and to bring together, and in fact, there were others, technical cooperation across many topics that were beyond my own level of comfort and familiarity and competence, that together we could bring together this operation. Tatiana, we have a question from the room, if you don't mind.
Fantastic. Go ahead. If you could, sorry, before you start, if you could identify yourself, just tell us your name, to whom the question is addressed, and just the question, especially for those of us which are remotely, that would really help us.
Okay, my name is Asad Mohammed, and in a sense, the question is really addressed to the 3 panelists. And I think your question I was thinking about it, but that stimulated my question. I'm curious about the sequencing of the concepts of what are the policy areas that the country would work on and the need for financing. Because it appeared, as Robin said, it was in the manifesto of the incoming government, some of these are additional items. So that obviously there's a stimulation. So is it that the loan stimulates, the possibility of the loan stimulates the action, or the implementation of actions that were being thought of and being implemented are stimulated by, which comes first? And what's the kind of sequencing and time frame? And any of the 3 parties can answer that question.
Thank you very much, Asad. And if you want, we'll just ask, the 3 of our panelists, if Gerard, do you want to start? Then we'll
Yeah,
pass
let
to
me just go
Ophelia. And
quickly. Yeah. No, that's a good question, and it's really, again, doing the analysis of what's happening within the policy agenda, and the loan or the financing supporting that effort. It's really the agenda environment that's taking place. So in cases like the Bahamas, they had started a policy agenda on strengthening environmental regulations and strengthening environmental management. And they needed to move from say, a unit was managing environmental matters to a department, and all the associated regulations and acts that needed to take place, and that will take place over time. What happened was, because of this impetus from the bank to help them move along, it moved the agenda along a little quicker. And I think that's where how the sequencing goes, and that's what you really want. You want, for us, what we want is to support the countries in this journey, not to take it over, not to impose ourselves on it, but to support. And I think, Tatiana, you had mentioned that this is a partnership, and so one of the things that is critical that we when we look at the operations is to do an analysis of the policy environment and see where you can move things along a little quicker in 1 year, and then also some things that may take a longer time. So you may have to go in with those items a little more slowly and incrementally, and so I think that's been our experience.
Ophelia, Robin, if you have a different answer or something complementary, go ahead. Or if
just that I agree with Gerard, but it's just complementary in the sense that it can work both ways. It really depends on the political economy and the dynamics of the moment. But I think that if you have a dialogue on a specific topic, maybe a law is cooking and then you would need to help prepare the law, or maybe the law will be fastly approved because there is this need of quick money and this policy financing over that, and then we will follow up on the work with technical assistance. So really both ways. Thank you.
Yes, I agree that the dynamic works in both directions. In the case of Barbados, it's clear that the government had a vision. I would even say it even predates the existing government. There has been a long-term emphasis on sustainability in different lexicon. The fact that we have had 4 coastal zone management loans, I think, in this country dating back decades is evidence that there's been a long-term agenda towards addressing issues of sustainability. What we heard consistently from the government, not just being said to us, but to other donors and being said on the world stage, even as Prime Minister Mia Mottley said just about a week ago at the Americas Forum, is that there's a need for the development community and the financial sectors internationally to become more creative in their ability to respond to the new scale and depth of challenges that small island development states are grappling with. So we heard that over and over, the term financial architecture. We don't just want more of the same. We need a mixture, or we need to see what you can innovate, how you can innovate to help us. And quite frankly, we'll talk to others and see what else they can bring to the table, because the financial architecture up to this point has inadequately served the specific needs of small island development states, and especially those grappling with challenges not of our own making. So that was something we heard over and over. The policy-based loan, the programmatic series was part of that. The guarantee that is under preparation now was part of that. The debt for nature swap that is associated with that guarantee is part of that. Investment loans are part of that, as is grant financing and seeking to have countries be reclassified in terms of their access and not just be excluded to some forms of grant money or concessional finance because per capita GDP is high at a particular moment in time. So definitely the impetus came from the government. The reform agenda was there, the vision was there. We helped, as Gerald said, to define areas of intervention and reform more specifically, not just with sectoral scans and policy, but actual assessments of weak points, pain points in the agenda across sectors.
Thanks, Robin. I'm not sure whether there are any other questions from.
There is a follow-up.
Perfect.
I'll couch my language very carefully for this one. I am actually no longer in the business of trying to influence or negotiate on loans, but there's always a debate at the country level, political debate around borrowing conditionalities. And you always hear them say, well, this is being done in a criticism of the government because it's a conditionality of the World Bank or the IDB in all contexts. So the EMA, or environmental review legislation, was couched as World Bank conditionalities. And somebody mentioned in the discussion the issue that you all also ally and enter into discourse with national technocrats, because often I found that the country is not a monolithic. It's not a monolithic framework. There are many different elements in it, and that sometimes the dialogue between certain elements in the technocracy can actually be to try and make use of something like a policy-based loan to pursue an agenda which they may have been working on for a while and couldn't get traction. I mean, that has been my experience. So I've actually in the past worked with the IDB and the technocrats to try and achieve things which you wouldn't necessarily get in the support of the government or the minister at the time. I mean, ultimately you did have to do it. So, I mean, so that's why I was asking the question about the sort of timing, because I see it as a dynamic process in which technical people can interface and try and influence the agenda. And a policy-based loan does give a lot of room for that. But like I said, I wouldn't say that. I would not have said this or raised this issue some time ago because I was in the process of trying to influence the direction of policy. But it seems to me that it does provide room for multiple actors and agendas to be achieved in the context of another condition, that is the requirement for liquidity and so on. So that's just a follow-up comment more than a question. I don't know if anybody wants to react to that.
Yes, Asad, I think, as Ophelia said, the political economy is a big part of it. But when the record, if ever we were to write a record of what really went down with, in these periods of fiscal stress and how countries were able to access money, the truth will be that technocrats in places like the Coastal Zone Management Unit got through a technological program application developed and approved by cabinet, etc., that was instrumental to accessing liquidity at a large level, and similarly in other departments. So in the past, those kind of efforts have been invisible, have been overlooked, have been downplayed, and have never had the level of visibility and level of influence on major issues of liquidity. Through policy-based lending, those efforts are getting more visibility, more weight, and more impact. So, yeah.
Robin, if I might add, I just wanted to say that in general nowadays, especially for investment lending, we have very few conditionalities. What for investment lending, we just make sure that there is a better preparation and a greater level of maturity before moving onto approval. For policy actions, there's a bit of a mix, but in most cases, for instance, I was thinking about the case of Mexico that Ophelia presented. There had been a very long history of joint work through technical cooperation prior to moving to having a policy-based loan. And that policy-based loan was heavily debated. It was approved in the case of Mexico. The whole of the new territorial system and the new law was approved, through consensus. So I think some of the policies and some of the reforms take at times a little longer to mature. I think we've also understood that it's been changing progressively. It doesn't happen always, but I think it's also part of the work and the style of work that we're having now. And typically by the time a policy loan is presented to our board of directors, it has achieved through the leadership of the government most of the actions that that are contemplated for a greater goal or objective. So I think there's been changes also in the way in which multilateral development banks handle and manage policy-based lending. Not always the case, I'm not saying, but in the majority of the cases, I think there is a different perspective. Wonderful. I realize that we are 15 minutes over the time. Maybe this is a good moment to close this session, to thank the Caribbean Urban Forum to have invited all of us to be with you in this closing session to talk about policy-based lending, which especially in the context of sustainability and territorial planning, which is a real passion for us. So once again, thank you very much, and thank you very much to our speakers for their excellent presentations and in all honesty, for their true passion for the topic.
Thank you, Tada.
Thank you.
Folks, thank you very much for staying to the end.